Well, thanks again for being here. Well, let's continue on with chapter 18. You know, in Romans chapter 13, the church was told to be subject to the state. But then there's John the Baptist, who spoke out against the sin of a political ruler, one of the Herods, and he had his head cut off for it. So what are we supposed to do as Christians? Are we supposed to submit ourselves to the state, or are we supposed to call the state into account? Well, the revival of imperialism in the West, this is really a lot about politics. The church in the West gains a political ally. While the church in the East was sort of grinding to a standstill, as we saw in our last session, the Western church was expanding. The popes after Gregory I, they had tremendous power. Why? Because he did. He got it all and they kept it. Both ecclesiastical, meaning church power, and political or state power. To maintain their power, however, the church needed a governmental, a political, and a military presence. Are we starting to see even further shift? Since when is the church supposed to have a standing army? Got a bit of a problem. This sought-after alliance was found with the Franks. That's the French, the ancient French. Who were the predecessors, as we say, of modern France. The Franks were a very strong people in those days. The Franks were basically a number of disjointed tribes, as all of Europe was at that time, until Clovis, he was in the late 400s, early 500s. He united them, and they became the Frankish, or the French, modern-day term, empire. Clovis accepted Christianity in 496. Was it real or not? The united forces of the Franks under Clovis became the defenders of the papacy. They stood by the Pope. Why? Because Clovis was now Roman Catholic, and whether or not he was that because of religious purposes or merely for political purposes, there you have it. They would, if we were using like Godfather terms, if we were using terms from organized crime, the Franks were the muscle for Rome. Okay, they were the enforcers for the Pope. It was during this time that the Roman Church, with the military help of Clovis and the Frank forces, expanded the church's domain and gained vast amounts of land. Land. You know how in the Bible it talks about how the church needs to get as much real estate as they can? In Matthew chapter 8, verse 20, Jesus said, "Foxes have holes and the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Then there's a footnote where Jesus says, "But you, try to go get as much land as you can." No, that's not in the Bible. That's not in the Bible. The church's land ownership on such a grand scale was a direct contradiction of our Lord's teaching. Now, you got to indulge me for a minute. I got to tell you a little story. How did McDonald's become the largest fast food and conglomerate of its? It wasn't the hamburgers, friends. It wasn't the hamburgers. It was the land. After the business was stolen from the McDonald brothers, Kroc was counseled, you're not going to ever make as much money as you want by selling burgers. What you need to do is you need to buy real estate, and all of the franchises need to lease the real estate from you. By doing that, you've got control over anything that happens, and if they don't do what you want, you got it. McDonald's became a world concern in terms of the food business because of their real estate holdings. Now, why do I bring that up? Because they kept getting more land for the church. When you own the land, you own what happens on the land, especially if you've got the muscle there, which in those days was the Frank Clovis and his armies. When Clovis died, his sons, as is typically the case, it seems this way, sometimes great leaders, because Clovis was a pretty strong guy. He was a pretty big guy to take care of business as he did. But his sons, second generation wealth and power, sometimes not so much. They were kind of ne'er-do-wells, incompetent to lead. So bureaucrats took over. They were known in those days, and I won't try to pronounce it in French because I can't, nor do I particularly want to, but they were called the mayors of the palace, and they ran the Frankish government. while Clovis's sons played kings by reigning but not ruling, if you know what I mean. They had the titles, but they didn't really know what was going on. And the mayors of the palace ran the whole place. The successive mayors of the palace made up what is called in history the Carolingian dynasty, which, if you look it up on a map, you will see that the Carolingian dynasty was just about all of Western Europe. It was huge. It wasn't just France. It was gigantic. It went on to the Teutonic people, or the people up in the north, the Germanic peoples. They had control of all of this. 4 Carolingian rulers in succession after Clovis. Pepin of Heristal, who was the first mayor of the palace to rule over Clovis's domain. Pepin made his office hereditary. You know, I've got a bureaucratic job, but I want this bureaucratic job not only for my life, but for my family's life. So he just, that's what happens when you're in charge. So he ensured positions of power for his posterity. He ruled from 687 to 714. The next one, when Pepin died in 714, did I say the last one wrong? I said 714. His son, who happened to have been an illegitimate son, but it must have been by one of his favorite girls on the side. His name was Charles Martel. He became ruler. By the way, doesn't this kind of remind you sometimes of the succession in family lines in the book of Judges? You get a guy who is like great, and then his sons are knuckleheads, and they try to keep the dream alive. He was a strong military man. He was sorely needed by the papacy because, once again, the Franks or the Carolingians, they were the muscle for Rome, and they needed help to keep the Muslims at bay. They'd already overrun Spain by the time Pepin came around. Charles defeated the Muslims in the name of Christianity and thus sort of saved the church. That's in France, not in Spain. The church was, of course, indebted to him for this. The church, therefore, was indebted to the state. The church was indebted to the state. What happens if the church is beholden to the state? Then the church isn't listening. They don't have to listen to Christ. They have to do what this happens. We see this in modern day in denominations, not the state, but we see this in denominations. People in a left-leaning or liberal-leaning denomination that has a lot of money will look to their denomination to help them secure their property to build their church. And then if the denomination continues to go left and the local church goes, you know what, you guys are departing from the thing, we're going to be out of there. The church holds up the deed and says, where do you think you're going? Your property belongs to us. Oh yeah, you can leave if you come up with the $5 million you owe us. Same thing was happening here, but worse, because it was the church being beholden to the state. Charles's son, Pepin II, named for Charles, his father, was next in line to rule. He was known as Pepin the Short and by the name Pepin the Great. I like to include that because now, look, with no disrespect to any of my brothers and friends who are vertically challenged, it is very interesting to me that sometimes, we've heard the phrase, little man syndrome. Well, this guy had it. He was very short, and so he said, call me, I don't want to be called Pepin the Short. Don't call me Shorty, call me Great. Call me Great. So that's why he got the name. He ruled along with his brother, kind of co-leadership for a while, from 741 to 747. When his brother decided to leave and join a monastery, leaving Pepin as the sole ruler, in 751, Pepin declared himself no longer a mayor of the palace, but what? I want to be king, because what? I'm not short, I'm great. And he was consecrated to be king of the Franks by who? By Boniface. Boniface was not the Pope, but Boniface was an archbishop. He was that Germanic archbishop under Gregory III, who he was recognized as a saint, interestingly enough. Boniface is recognized as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church, by the Eastern Orthodox Church, by the Lutheran Church, and even by the Anglican Church of England. So he's got some stuff. He was very religious, but he was very political. In 754, Pope Stephen II crowned Pepin king of the Franks and patrician of the Romans. Pepin conquered more land. Get more land. He conquered more land and he donated much of it to the papacy. Now the papacy is even further beholden to the government because, after all, they gave us this land. Interesting. the church becomes more and more rich. By the way, if you look at the footnote on the next page, on what basis did the church believe that it was right to be such a great possessor of land? Here's the answer. A document entitled The Donation of Constantine set the precedent. This document told of how Constantine had received a healing from God, and as a thank offering, he donated large pieces of land to the church. There are two problems with this. First, so what if Constantine did donate church land to the church? So what if he did that? That doesn't mean that God's word says to do it. But besides that, secondly, the donation of Constantine was later proven to be fraudulent. It was a lie. And nobody even really disputes that now. Even the Roman Catholic Church, they don't talk about it. They don't dispute it. So we've got a doctrine that says it's okay for us to own all this land because of this document over here that isn't even true, and we know it. But that's our story, and we're not changing. It's just like, godliness or something different. Remember I told you at the very beginning of this, one of the most important things to learn from church history is the relationship between church and state. This chapter is really about this. This really is. The Roman church and the state were always trying to dominate each other. They were always jockeying. Was it the Pope or was it the king who was in charge? One of the ways they did this was established during the Carolingian dynasty, during this time of the mayors of the palace. The king would provide military protection or give land to the church in an effort to make the church indebted to the king, and then the Pope would grant the title to the king, claiming only the church had authority to call anybody a king, so that made the church, the state beholden to the church. It was like they were both playing a game of bluffing one another here. It's really sad. I said there was 4 Carolingian leaders. The 4th one is Charlemagne. Charlemagne is a guy who he's more fun than the rest because this guy is he's like a mythical hero. I mean, he really did live, but he's an incredibly strange man, if you can say that. He lived from 742 to 814. He came to power when he was only 26 years old. In 768, the Pope crowned him Emperor of the Romans. Interesting. He becomes the Emperor of the Romans. Quite a climb from a guy who is the 4th in line succession of some guys who were bureaucrats. And now he's the Emperor of the Roman Empire. It's also ironic that here his lineage comes from the barbarians who were considered to be less than Roman, and now he's the emperor of Rome. He was a very unusual character. He was said to be 7 feet tall. Now, whether or not that's literally true or not, I don't know. I remember my grandfather telling me of his grandfather, who he loved so much. Obviously, I never knew him. And my grandfather used to tell me all the time, yeah, my grandfather was 7 feet tall. And I'd say, yeah, Grandpa, you were 5. And he was probably 5'9", and he just looked 7 feet tall. After my grandfather had died, I was very close, my family was very close with one of my grandfather's sisters, who's also now gone on to her reward. And one time we were visiting her, our whole family was out visiting Aunt Eunice, bless her heart, we loved her so much. And she was pulling out old pictures and showing me and Francis and the girls these pictures. And she goes, oh, and here's a picture of my grandfather, your grandpa, and your aunts and I, we all lived with them for a while. And she pulled out this picture, and he's standing there, and everyone was this tall to him. So maybe Charlemagne was 7 feet tall. I don't know. But at any rate, he was a very interesting character. He was said to have had long hair. And it was white, probably blonde, but that was not common among those people. People were all dark-haired there. He was an outstanding outdoorsman. He had tremendous administrative skills. Charlemagne was so successful as a military conqueror that his kingdom swelled and became larger than any other since the old Roman Empire. It reached its zenith during that time. Charlemagne was a strong proponent of education and culture. He realized that many people in his realm couldn't read or write. He goes, no, we need to get people educated. He could read, he could write, so he wanted everybody to be able to do that. That's good. He wanted them to be cultured. He read the writings of St. Augustine, the one from Hippo, the one that we usually recognize as St. Augustine. And he liked that. He desired an accurate interpretation and understanding of the Bible. He wanted the people in his realm to know the Bible, interestingly enough. Of course, there's no printing press. How are they going to get it to the people? But at least it was a good idea. He was religious, as I write here, but like King Solomon of ancient Israel, Charlemagne had a number of women besides his wife. You know, when you're 7 feet tall and you're, Mr. Outdoorsman, you can't say no to all these poor babies that need you, So he was probably pretty full of himself. Charlemagne's relationship with the Roman Church was very important. He believed that God had ordained both the king and the pope. Well, so do we, because the Bible says so. Not the pope, but the religious leaders and the governmental leaders. He likened the church to the soul, and he said that the state was the body, and they were to be united. And there's a problem. They're not to be united. They're two different groups, ordained by God for two different purposes. Even less surprisingly, the Pope saw it the other way around, because he thought that the king should be subject to, the Pope should be subject to him, and the Pope said, no, you should be subject to me, and they went back and forth, back and forth. It's still a conflict. It's still a conflict of the church and the state. When then Pope Leo III was in trouble, Charlemagne supported him, making the Pope indebted to him. He really bailed the Pope out, Leo III. He bailed him out of some troubles because he had the muscle. And now you owe me. Now you owe me. When Charlemagne died, his sons and grandsons, as is often the case, were not able to rule as he did. The Frankish / Carolingian / Teutonic / Germanic Roman Empire began to decline after Charlemagne. The Roman Church's empire continued to gain strength. So we have this church state, but because there wasn't a strong leader in the church after Charlemagne, the state started going, there wasn't a strong leader in the government after Charlemagne, the government started to decline, but the Pope's power continued to go up. 3 important historical facts regarding Charlemagne. Charlemagne's coronation marks the revival of the Roman Empire with a barbarian or Teutonic king. This is a huge shift. Remember, the Romans were completely different, and remember we did a whole lesson some time back about what happened when the barbarians came in. That's his lineage. He was from the barbarians, and now they're ruling over a revived Roman Empire. Because the Pope crowned Charlemagne, the emperor was indebted to the Pope as one from whom power was granted, as though he got it from the Pope. Charlemagne tried to reunite the Eastern and Western churches. The Eastern Church was relegated to some impotence and obscurity. Charlemagne said, let's get these two back together. It didn't work so well. Charlemagne attempted to reunite these two politically and ecclesiastically, meaning church and state. He even offered to marry Irene, which was very, very big of him, to take yet another wife, again for political purposes. She was the Empress of the East. He figured that might help. It was not meant to be. The Eastern Church and the Western Church remained divided to this day. What do we say in conclusion to this? The church in the West grew and gained power, while the church in the East stagnated and began grinding to a halt. Why the difference? One difference was that the Eastern Church was under control of the state, whereas the church in the West was not. They were jockeying back and forth, but not completely controlled by the state. When the church is subject to the state, the church suffers. But when the state is subject to the church, both suffer. God hasn't ordained either one of those. He's ordained the church and the state both to be his instruments, but with different purposes. Who should dominate the other? Neither. Remember we started talking about, this session talking about Romans chapter 13, that we're told to submit ourselves to civil authorities, and we are. And then we were reminded, but John the Baptist said, you can't do that, and was killed for it even. This is kind of the difference between the church and the state. The state has the authority to rule, and they're given the sword. They abuse it, no doubt. The church, that's the state. The church does not have the sword. The church is not to rule over, but the church is to be the moral conscience that is not afraid to call the church into account when to call the state into account when they're acting sinfully, even if it means we lose our head for it. We can't be afraid. The church cannot be afraid to say to the state, that's wrong. That's wrong. We are there ordained by God to call the state into account when it's acting sinfully. Church state, delicate balance. Delicate balance. God give us wisdom in these days to know what to do when the state is trying to dictate to the church how to be the church. Or if the church is trying to dictate to the state how to be a church. State's not called to be a church. We've got to recognize the difference. Big turning point. Big things going on in the time of the Carolingians.